back in.
Oh, excellent. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to December's Employer Engagement Forum. Great to have so many of you here. Shall I set out the agenda for this morning?
Yes, please, Jo.
So thank you to our wonderful speakers. I'm just hang on. Bear with me while I locate the agenda. Sorry, it isn't on a slide.
Shall I just tell the people who our special guests are whilst you find that, Jo?
Exactly.
So hi everyone, it's Tony Carr here. If you don't know me, I'm the director of Forefront Partners and an employer engagement geek, apparently, according to Jo. We've moved the Employer Engagement Forum from a couple of weeks ago, so we could accommodate some of our guests today. So I'm very pleased to let you know that we have got a packed agenda today that Jo is just about to find. So that's why I'm filling. But we have got some really great speakers for us today. We've got Nick Riddle, Deputy Director at DWP. He's going to be here to talk to us about the Kickstart Programme. We've also got Kat goes. Kat, help me out with your surname here. I don't want to get it wrong.
Gazzoli.
Kat Gazzoli from Piccolo Foods. Kat, thank you so much for joining us. We're also going to have Sharon Blyfield from Coca-Cola. And later on, we're also going to have Angela Matthews, Head of Policy for the Business Disability Forum, and we'll be joined also by Mark Capper from MenCap. I hope I haven't forgotten anyone there, but of course, we'll also have the amazing Elizabeth Taylor at the end, giving us some update from ERSA's point of view. Jo, was that good filling?
I think that, yes, and I haven't found the agenda, so but I think that sounds fine. So Nick, I think our first speaker.
You are indeed.
I am. Do you want me to kick off?
Please do.
I think Elizabeth, were you going to say something before Nick spoke? Sorry.
It's okay. I was just going to say that obviously we're delighted to have Nick with us today. He is the DWP lead on Kickstart. We have many questions and frustrations and discussions going on around Kickstart, but today Nick is specifically going to talk about the employer engagement. And I am collating issues and evidence of problems and various things to put forward some constructive feedback to the department, and I've been requested to do that by the Secretary of State. So can we try and focus just on the employer engagement element today and not bombard Nick with all those practical process decision-making questions? That's just an appeal, because it's a really good agenda, and this is our employer engagement forum, and we can pick up all those things at the next Kickstart event. So that's just it from me from now. Thank you. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invite. I hope everyone's keeping well. It's a lovely sunny day where I am. It looks sunny where Kat is as well. It looks absolutely beautiful. I'm Nick Riddle. I am Deputy Delivery Director for the Kickstart Scheme. So I'm not quite the DWP lead for it, but I guess I'm responsible for the day-to-day running of the operational aspects of it. So in broad terms, what that means is that if you submit an application, it'll be one of my team that consider it. It'll be one of my team that might talk to you about it. It'll be one of my team that process you through to approvals board, and ultimately, if you are a successful applicant, then your bid will ultimately be approved by me. So I just want to, I think, in all fairness, just link in with something that some of you on the call might have heard me just say earlier, but just again, because I know colleagues are joining at different times, something that Elizabeth said, which is DWP is not sitting here and saying, everything is absolutely brilliant, it's running on rails, it's as good as it can be. We do know that we've got challenges out there. In particular, we know we've got challenges out there in the gateway space, but certainly over the course of the last 3 or 4 weeks since I've taken up post, we've made massive inroads in terms of the work to process our pure employer applications. And we are now turning towards the gateway side of things. And again, we're making really good progress in clearing down that head of work. But I think from my perspective, what I would say is this is a sort of situation where we are all in this together, and we are trying as hard as we possibly can to get through all of this work. So if colleagues on the call are thinking that people in DWP are sitting there sipping cocktails and cups of tea, I can guarantee you that we're not. We are genuinely trying to move mountains to get this out of the door, and that is because this is a great scheme, right? And we want everyone to be involved, we want everyone's bids to go through, and we want stacks and stacks of young people to have really, really positive work placements that otherwise they wouldn't have had if the scheme wasn't there. So I'm not here saying everything's rosy in the forest. It's not, but we are working incredibly hard to get it that way. So what I was going to do, colleagues, if that's okay with you, was I guess give you just a super quick update on the scheme, because I don't know very many of you on the call. So if this is a repeat for some of you and you're sitting there thinking, well, actually, I know what Kickstart's about, I don't need to worry about it, then you can feel free to take 2 or 3 minutes to get a cup of tea. And then what I was going to do was just talk to you a bit about the elements of the scheme, how we assess employer bids, and I guess just give you some tips. So I'm guessing either some of you will have bids in with us, some of you might have had bids in that have been rejected and might be thinking about a repeat application, or some of you might be sitting there pen in hand thinking, right, what do we do? What does he mean by this? Is DWP going to knock me out? How's it going to work? So I'm going to do that if that's okay. And also, I think I want to give you a little bit of an advance notice about something else that we're looking at as well, which is just something that we know has been causing quite a lot of frustration, particularly for the employer community. So if that sounds okay, I will rabbit through it. So Kickstart, what is it then? So in essence, Kickstart is the flagship program from government to support young people at risk of long-term unemployment by providing funding for 6 months worth of work placements. And what that in essence means is that DWP will fund the salary for the relevant age range of the national minimum wage for 6 months, along with the associated contributions as well. In addition to that, we will fund an upfront payment of £1,500 per young person that starts with a Kickstart employer. That funding is payable on confirmation that the young person has started, and in essence the funding, I think, is to reflect 2 main elements. It's to reflect the cost of onboarding a new employee, but more importantly than that, it's to reflect the employability aspect of the work placement. And I will come on to talk a bit about what we mean by that, if that makes sense, when I talk about how we assess a bid, because that area is really, really key. So if you are an employer, how can you apply to DWP? What does that look like? So there are 2 routes for you to come to us. If you want to offer 30 placements or more, then currently you can come to us direct. And you can go via gov.uk, your application will wing its way into us, and it is correct that if you come to us direct as an employer, you will pass through the assessment process very quickly, provided that we don't need more information from you. Now, it is sometimes the case that when we see a bid, we look at it and we think it's not quite there, but actually this is a conversation rather than an outright reject, if you see what I mean. So in those situations, somebody from DWP would be in touch and would say to you, Kat, for argument's sake, can you give us a bit more information about what you meant by this? We didn't quite understand it. Can you just flesh out these jobs for us in a bit more detail? And then we will use that information to hopefully progress that organisation through to a pass phase. The second way that you can come via DWP for Kickstart is if you are an employer and you are offering less than 30 vacancies, you may apply via what we call a gateway organisation, which has in the past been called an intermediary. And in essence, the way that will work then is the intermediary, sorry, my language, the gateway will represent your interest with DWP. So in essence, the gateway will be responsible for applying on your behalf to DWP. And the gateway may be responsible for arranging some elements of the employability aspects of the Kickstart scheme. But it opens the door then to those smaller employers who can't muster the 30 vacancies to come direct to us. And the way that works then is, in essence, it means that DWP's relationship is with the gateway organisation as opposed to the individual employer, and that we will pass our monies through to the gateway organisation and they will be responsible for passing them down to the employer. One key thing there is that if you do come to us via a gateway, the gateway is not responsible for triaging the young people on your behalf. So the young people would still come direct to the employer for you guys to sift and make sure you're comfortable with the quality of the candidates that DWP is providing to you. And then ultimately it is the individual employer's responsibility to select the successful young people for your 6-month work placement. So how do we assess a bid then? So how do we look at it? If you go on gov.uk, there are a number of declarations that we require the employers to make. But in essence, DWP assesses a Kickstart bid against 3 main criteria. And slightly oddly, Elizabeth, I'm not going to start at the start, which is where I started last time, because actually this is, I think, the part that I just want to pause on. So it probably needs 1 or 2 more minutes at the end. So the 2 key elements that we look at when we assess a Kickstart bid are the concepts of additionality and employability. Now, by additionality, what we mean is that the jobs need to be demonstrably above the existing allocation that the organisation has. Now, that means they can be new jobs, if that makes sense, but you cannot use a Kickstart placement to fulfil a job that you have already advertised, for argument's sake. So let's say you work in HR and you've got, I don't know, a trainee HR assistant advert out there on LinkedIn or Indeed or Monster. You cannot use a Kickstart person to fill that job, if that makes sense. And so there are kind of 2 ways that you can demonstrate that to DWP. The least effective way, to be candid, is just a list of jobs, quite frankly, because it's hard for us to tell from a list of jobs whether they are truly additional. Now, if to preempt some questions, if colleagues are going to say, well, does that mean that if I'm an organisation with 1,300 people doing a particular job and I want 10 more of those people, can I apply? And the answer is yes, you can. But you need to be able to demonstrate to us why those jobs were not already budgeted for. So the best example I can give you guys is DWP is doing a big piece of recruitment at the minute, as some colleagues will know. We're recruiting, I think, around 13,000 work coaches. Now, in that environment, if DWP were to apply for Kickstart jobs and was ultimately able to demonstrate that we had funding for 13,000 work coaches and we wanted 10 more that were not funded, technically Kickstart could fund those, if you see what I mean, for 6 months. So that's the first way that people can apply and I guess demonstrate that additionality. I will say we do see varying ways that that is demonstrated to us, and it's really important then that when you're applying you try to make it really clear why those jobs are over and above your existing headcount. The second, and in my opinion, I guess the simplest way of demonstrating that is that this is something completely new that the organisation hasn't thought about before. So I will give you a practical example of that. So a few weeks ago, we saw a chain of self-serve restaurants in London come to us with a bid. It's not a household name, just in case anyone's wondering, but nonetheless, it was a chain of restaurants that, in essence, you walked in, you picked what you wanted, you went and sat down, you had a meal, you left, no problem. And the organisation came to us and said, well, we want to try something a bit different for 6 months. We want to try a variation in our business model. And what we want to try is we want to try this concept of trainee customer hosts. So instead of just walking in and wandering and picking your food, actually, when you come into the restaurant, you are greeted by someone, and that someone says to you, what sort of food you enjoy? This is really good this evening. This goes really well with that. All of these sorts of things. And that was quite an easy way for that organisation to demonstrate to DWP that actually this was a completely new thing, if you see what I mean. Now, that's just one example, and we might have some questions later on when we get to that stage. But in essence, that's what we mean by additionality. There is, I think, a little bit of an urban myth that organisations cannot have made anyone redundant at all. That's not quite correct. It is a risk area for us because we would be concerned that, for argument's sake, if a particular post had been made redundant, that could not be filled by someone from the Kickstart scheme. But let's take a really realistic and cold view of this. This is not an easy time for business. We all know that, whether we're in government or in business. And it is not, therefore, beyond the realms of possibility that a really good employer that is going to carry on for the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years in one part of its business had made some people redundant. But what we're asking for is that if that has happened in the particular business, then we'd like to have really clear details about exactly why that was, where it was, and why the Kickstart placement would not, in essence, just slot straight back into that job. So it's not a red light, if that makes sense, but I think it's probably more of an amber. It's one that probably would prompt a conversation. So I think it's likely we would reach out to the employer and say, you told us you'd made some positions redundant. Where? Is it in a different part of the business? How are these people completely different? So it's not a no, but it is a let's have a conversation if we're not satisfied from what you've put in the bid. The second area that we look at is this slightly odd phrase, at least I think it's odd, you might not, of employability. And what we mean by that is that it's really important to stress, colleagues, that these are not full-time jobs. They are 6 months at the moment, work placements. And whilst we would really want, all of us, wouldn't we, that you guys get on really well with the people that the job centre send you, and ultimately you say, actually, that person is a brilliant employee, we want to offer them a full-time job, that is not going to happen in all of these situations. So on that basis, a key element of the Kickstart scheme, and I guess a condition of our contract with you as employers or you as gateways, is that we expect you to provide employability support to that young person. And by that we mean, if that young person has a great 6 months, but ultimately, for whatever reason, the business is unable to keep that young person on, then when they walk back into the job centre, we don't want them to walk back in and say, I've spent 25 hours a week photocopying. We want them to come in and say, I've spent 25 hours a week in different workplaces in this amazing company, and this is what I've learned. My confidence has gone up. I can do the world's best CV, or ace it at interview, or I've got a food hygiene certificate, or I've got this, I've got that. And that means the work coach can say, fantastic, you've had a brilliant 6 months. There's your full-time job, go and grab it. And so that's what we mean by employability. It is that support to make the young person at the end of the placement as marketable as they possibly can be to their next employer. I do sometimes get asked, well, have you got a minimum standard? What does it look like, to be honest? And the answer to that is, I do know the guidance is quite vague, but we have deliberately kept it vague because businesses come in all shapes and sizes. So employability support for one sort of a business or one sector will be very different to another. And we see a plethora of areas that are put forward to us as business as employability support. I think for me, as an absolute baseline, given we're paying £1,500 by, for each young person, the absolute minimum that we expect to see is assistance around good CV, how to effectively look for work, perhaps a difference in sorts of sectors, perhaps mentoring, something along those particular lines. And we see that, I would say probably baseline level, right the way up to employers coming to us and saying, we're going to invest money with the Prince's Trust, we're going to put the young people through our in-house accredited qualification scheme, whatever that might look like. But in essence, you need to be able to demonstrate to us what benefit over and above a young person being in work, which is already a great benefit, right? The placement with your organisation will provide. But we want to be as flexible as we can be with that, but has to be something there, if that makes sense. And it's important to stress as well that as we go through the customer's placement with you, they will still retain the relationship with the DWP work coach. And Elizabeth, I think when we had the ERSA event with Gateways, we were perhaps a little bit vaguer about what that would look like. And we do now, I think, have a much more defined process, which will involve regular check-ins between the young person and their work coach. And we'll be wanting to make sure through those checkups that the employability support and the experience that we're paying public money out for is actually being met. And that's not to try and trick people, and we realise that things will be changing, but we do want to make sure that this is a valuable experience for the young person and the employer, and it gives you as an employer that chance to talk to DWP as well, if that makes sense. So if it's not going very well, we kind of want to have a conversation with you as an employer, because we want to do what we can to support you and the young person and stop them falling back into the benefit system. Then the final thing that I want to talk about, because I think it's a really important part, particularly for employers, less so for gateway organisations, if I'm being absolutely candid, is that before we assess a bid against additionality and employability, we run the organisation through something that we call a spotlight check. Now, that information is on gov.uk, so this is not anything that, excuse me, this is not anything that's particularly secret, but in essence, Spotlight checks a number of things, and its intention is that it gives us, if you like, an assessment of the organisation's suitability to receive public money. Now, what's really challenging for us about that is that at the moment we are getting a lot of feedback that we are looking at, and if I'm being candid, kind of nodding and saying, why are we knocking this organisation out of Spotlight? For arguments, to give you an example, if you are an organisation between 1 and 2 years old and you have not filed your accounts at Companies House, you would fail Spotlight. And Spotlight is a very binary parcel fail. So where with additionality or employability, that is a human and subjective judgment. So if we're not comfortable with something there and it is the jobs look good and we think actually this organisation just hasn't represented it very well, then we'll have a conversation. If you fail Spotlight, there is no conversation to be had. You have failed Spotlight. It's as simple as that. There is nothing we can do. It is a binary parcel fail. And I think the concern that we've got as DWP then is that we could have some excellent organisations applying to us who are between 1 and 2 years old. We could have some excellent organisations applying to us who are sole traders, who are partnerships but are not limited companies. And the key thing for us is, and again, I think we'd all be on the same page, is that when that young person walks into the job centre, perhaps not particularly looking forward to the interview they're going to have, that actually they sit there and the work coach says, look at all these jobs, look at all these sectors, look at all these businesses, look at what your future could be like, pick one and go for it. And what we don't want to do then is artificially throttle that market by knocking people out when actually we should be passing them through. Now, clearly, we've all got a responsibility as businesses and government to make sure that we are not funding organisations that are likely to fail, but at the same time, we need to make sure that we get that balance right, if I'm being honest. So what we are doing at the moment is we are reviewing our use of the Spotlight tool. Now, just to be really clear, I am not saying, and neither is DWP, that we will stop using Spotlight, because we have to have a means of a cold assessment of a company before we start looking at that employability and additionality. But we are actively reviewing how we are using Spotlight, whether there are other tools that we could use that would give us that level of assurance, but at the same time make sure that we can really maximise the use of the scheme. So I think that was hopefully a bit of a whistle-stop tour through it. Elizabeth, Tony, I'm not sure whether we're doing questions now or whether we're going on, but that I think was kind of my super quick tour of Spotlight. Not Spotlight, you can tell it's on my mind. Super quick tour of Kickstart.